The sound of clinking champagne glasses echoed through the grand ballroom, filled with elite businessmen and socialites. The deep red dress clung to Isabella Carter's curves, accentuating her elegance, but it still wasn't enough to capture her husband's attention. Seated at the main table, Ethan Lancaster, billionaire real estate mogul, laughed easily, surrounded by powerful men and stunning women, as if his wife didn't exist. She watched him closely. The way he tilted his head when a young model whispered in his ear, the slow smirk he gave the women around him, the way his gaze wandered, taking in bodies that weren't hers. Heat rose in Isabella's chest, but it wasn't just anger, it was humiliation. She tightened her grip on her champagne flute, her fingers pressing against the cool glass. "Do you even realize I'm here?" Her voice was controlled but firm, low enough that only he could hear. Ethan turned his head slowly, his piercing blue eyes scanning her from head to toe. His smirk remained, but now it carried something sharper. "I see you, Isabella. The problem is you don't see where you are." She held his gaze, her heart pounding. "And where exactly am I, Ethan?" He took a slow sip of his whiskey, eyes gleaming with amusement. "In the wrong place." The words hit like a slap. Isabella's breath caught, but she refused to lower her chin. "You're embarrassing me." His voice was low, edged with warning. She let out a bitter laugh. "And what exactly have you been doing since we arrived?" Ethan leaned in closer, his breath warm against her cheek, his tone laced with mockery. "You keep trying to act like your morals will change me, but you don't understand something, Isabella." His fingers brushed lightly over her arm, just enough to send a subtle shiver through her. His voice dropped. "I make the rules." She jerked her arm away, her pulse racing. "You don't. Own me, Ethan." His smirk deepened. "Don't I?" Before she could respond, he tapped his ring against his glass. The sharp sound cut through the room, drawing the attention of the guests. "A toast, everyone?" His voice carried easily through the ballroom. "Tonight we celebrate success and freedom." Laughter rippled through the crowd as people lifted their glasses, unaware of the true meaning behind his words. A chill ran down Isabella's spine. "Freedom," she murmured, dread tightening around her throat. Ethan swirled his drink lazily, eyes locked onto hers. "Yes, my love. Tonight I'm freeing myself from something that no longer serves me." The air in the room shifted. The laughter faded into murmurs. Isabella's fingers curled around the stem of her glass, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Ethan," he downed the rest of his whiskey, then set the glass down with finality. "I want a divorce." The world around her shattered in an instant. Silence. The entire ballroom had frozen in place. Ethan Lancaster's announcement sent ripples of shock through the air, whispers spreading like wildfire among the elite guests. But all Isabella could hear was the deafening roar in her ears. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, but she refused to let her hands tremble. He wanted a divorce just like that, as if she were nothing more than an outdated investment, a deal he was walking away from without a second thought. She forced herself to breathe, her heart pounding like a war drum against her ribs. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and steady. "You really think you can throw me away like I'm an accessory you no longer need?" Ethan swirled the ice in his glass, his expression unbothered. "Exactly." The cold finality of his words struck like a dagger. But Isabella didn't flinch. She could scream. She could demand answers. She could slap that smug expression off his face, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she exhaled slowly, lifted her chin and smiled. "Fine, Ethan. If that's what you want, then you'll have it." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Surprise? Doubt? But then it was gone, replaced by the same arrogant confidence. He leaned in closer, his breath warm against her skin. "Good. I was hoping you wouldn't make a scene." The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the sharpness of whiskey. That intoxicating blend she once loved now made her stomach turn. Still, her pulse betrayed her. The heat of his presence, the way his voice dipped into that low, knowing tone, it sent unwanted shivers down her spine. He always knew how to get under her skin. Not this time. She stepped back, letting her untouched champagne glass clink softly against the table. Don't get too comfortable, Ethan. One day you'll realize this was the biggest mistake of your life. His lips twitched in amusement, but something darker lingered in his gaze. We'll see. With that, Isabella turned on her heel and walked away, ignoring the murmurs, the judging eyes, the world crumbling beneath her. Because at that moment, she made a promise to herself. Ethan Lancaster would not destroy her, and one day, he'd regret ever trying. The apartment door shut with a hollow thud behind her. Isabella pressed her back against the wood, closing her eyes as she let out a shaky breath. Only now, away from prying eyes and judgmental whispers, could she finally let the weight of what happened settle over her. Her marriage was over, just like that. No warning, no discussion. Ethan had discarded her like a business deal gone stale. Her chest tightened as emotions warred inside her. Humiliation, betrayal, fury. She had been nothing but devoted to him, stood by him, and yet he had announced their divorce as if it were a casual transaction. A lump formed in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She would not cry over him, not now, not ever again. Isabella? A familiar voice broke through the silence. She opened her eyes to see Camille standing in the middle of the living room, concern etched into her face. Her best friend had been waiting for her, probably already knowing what had happened before Isabella could even say a word. One look at Camille's sympathetic expression was all it took. Isabella's carefully constructed armor cracked, and before she could stop herself, a sob tore through her chest. Camille rushed forward, wrapping her in a tight hug. "I came as soon as I heard that bastard. He never deserved you." Isabella clung to her friend, her body trembling from the force of her emotions. "He threw me away, Camille. In front of everyone. Like I was nothing." Camille tightened her grip, her voice firm. "No, you are not nothing, and he's a selfish, arrogant son of a bitch who's going to realize too late what he lost." Isabella pulled back slightly, wiping at her damp cheeks. "I can't believe I gave everything to him. I trusted him. I loved him." Camille cupped her face gently, forcing her to meet her gaze. "And now, you love yourself. That's what matters. Love herself." The words settled over her like an unfamiliar weight. When was the last time she had done that? For years she had molded herself to fit Ethan's world, playing the perfect wife, standing in his shadow while he basked in power. But she wasn't just Ethan Lancaster's discarded wife. She was Isabella Carter, and she was done playing by his rules. A new kind of fire ignited in her chest, one she hadn't felt before. She straightened her shoulders, the tears drying on her face as resolve took their place. "I won't let him do this to me, Camille." Her friend nodded. "Good, because he doesn't get to win." Isabella exhaled, her mind racing with possibilities. Ethan thought he had won. He thought he had stripped her of everything, but he was about to learn that she wasn't a woman who crumbled. She was a woman who rose. "Are you sure about this, Isabella?" The lawyer's voice was calm, measured, but Isabella could sense the underlying doubt. Maybe he, like so many others, believed Ethan Lancaster was untouchable. She gripped her phone tighter, her jaw set. "I'm sure. I want to fight for what's rightfully mine." There was a pause on the other end of the line before the lawyer sighed. "All right. We need to go over the terms of your marriage agreement. Did you sign a prenup?" Isabella closed her eyes for a moment. Yes, there had been a contract. Ethan never explained the details, and back then, blinded by love and trust, she hadn't questioned it. Now she realized that had been a mistake. "I did, but I don't remember all the clauses." The lawyer took another breath, this time heavier. "That could complicate things, but it doesn't mean you're powerless. As his wife, you have legal rights, especially after years of marriage. If we can prove he left you with nothing in a way that was financially abusive, we might be able to challenge certain conditions." Financially abusive. The phrase made something inside her tighten. Ethan had always controlled everything, his empire, his wealth, even the way people viewed him. He had built a world where he dictated the rules and expected everyone to obey. But not this time. Not with her. "Do whatever it takes. I won't let him walk away thinking he owns me." The lawyer hesitated for only a second before responding. "I'll go through the documents and call you as soon as I have something solid." She ended the call. a strange mix of relief and determination settling over her. She wasn't after Ethan's money for revenge. She was fighting for justice, for herself, for the years she had invested in that marriage, believing in a love that had never truly been reciprocated. From across the apartment, Camille watched her carefully, arms crossed. "You look different," Isabella lifted a brow. "Different how?" "Stronger and, honestly, more beautiful." A small laugh escaped Isabella. "Camille, please." "No, I mean it. It's like something in you finally woke up, like you finally see yourself the way the rest of us do." Isabella's smile faltered slightly as Camille's words settled in. Maybe she was right. For the first time in years, she felt awake. She turned to the hallway mirror, catching her own reflection. There were still traces of pain in her eyes, but underneath it, there was fire. A fire that Ethan had tried to extinguish. Straightening her shoulders, she ran a hand through her hair and took a slow, steady breath. "It's over, Ethan." The words were barely a whisper, but what she didn't realize was that the game between them was only just beginning. The ice clinked softly against the crystal glass as Ethan swirled his whiskey, staring out over the Manhattan skyline. His penthouse was quiet now, too quiet. The party from earlier had ended. The models and executives had left, and yet, despite everything, he felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief. He took a slow sip, the burn of the liquor sliding down his throat, but it did little to drown out the nagging sensation in his chest. He was free. Wasn't this what he wanted? No wife to question his decisions, no one to remind him of morals and principles he never cared for, and yet, he exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. A delicate laugh echoed from across the room. "You look lost, Mr. Lancaster." He barely turned his head. The blonde from earlier, one of the many who had been circling him at the party, was still here. Dressed in nothing but his shirt, she leaned against the bar, watching him with amusement. She was beautiful, tall, perfect features, the kind of woman who usually entertained him, and yet she didn't stir anything in him, not like her. He closed his eyes briefly. "Damn it. You can leave now." The woman blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Ethan finally turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I said leave now." She scoffed, snatching her purse from the bar. "You're a bastard, you know that?" Ethan smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You should have figured that out sooner." She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan exhaled sharply and sat on the leather couch, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together. Why the hell did he feel this way? He had won, hadn't he? He reached for his phone, his fingers hesitating over the screen before instinct took over. One quick search, just to see. When Isabella's name appeared, so did the latest photos of her. He froze. She was at a charity gala, standing tall, her posture radiating confidence. She wasn't broken. She wasn't begging to come back. No, she was thriving. His grip tightened around the phone. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She was his, even if he had been the one to push her away. And suddenly, Ethan realized, perhaps he had been too quick to let her go. Ethan Lancaster was not a man who accepted defeat. He dictated the rules, controlled the board, and made the world bend to his will. And yet here she was, Isabella Carter, untouchable. The images on his phone showed her standing at the center of a high-profile charity gala, radiating elegance and confidence. Her deep blue dress hugged her body in just the right way, but it wasn't just the dress that caught his attention. It was her, the way she held herself, the quiet strength in her posture, the effortless way she captivated the room without even trying. She didn't look like a woman who had been discarded. She looked like a woman who had been reborn. A strange, unfamiliar tightness settled in his chest. She should have been broken, devastated, crawling back to him. Instead, she was thriving. His jaw clenched as he tossed his phone onto the desk, irritation bubbling beneath his skin. "Sir?" His assistant's voice pulled him back to the present. He turned his gaze to the man standing at the office door. "What is it?" "I thought you'd like to know. Ms. Carter is making a name for herself. She's been heavily involved in charity work and..." Ethan cut him off with a sharp look. "I don't care what she's doing. The assistant hesitated before continuing. She also launched her own business, a high-end fashion atelier. Ethan stilled, his fingers curled into a fist against the desk. She what? She started her own company. It's already gaining traction. Some of the same social circles she used to be a part of are now backing her, not you. Ethan let out a slow breath, controlling the storm inside him. Isabella had moved on, not just emotionally, but strategically. She was building something of her own without him, and for some reason that infuriated him more than anything. Get my driver. I want to be at that gala in 20 minutes. The assistant hesitated. Sir, it's a charity event, focused on community development and faith-based programs. Your presence may not be well received. Ethan's lips curved into a slow, calculated smirk. I don't need an invitation. I own every room I walk into. The assistant swallowed hard before nodding and leaving to make arrangements. Ethan exhaled, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. He didn't know why this bothered him so much. He had been fine without her. Hadn't he? But something inside him burned at the thought of Isabella thriving without him. No, she wasn't supposed to win, not without him, and that's exactly why he had to see her tonight. The ballroom was alive with elegant conversation, the soft clinking of glasses, and the delicate hum of music. But Ethan Lancaster didn't care about any of it. His eyes were locked on one thing. Her Isabella stood near the center of the room, surrounded by a small group of business elites and philanthropists. She laughed at something someone said, her expression relaxed, her posture poised. She looked untouchable, unshaken, and that infuriated him. Ethan's grip tightened around the glass in his hand as he watched her. She had changed, not just in the way she carried herself, but in the way she owned the space around her. He wasn't sure if he admired it, or if he wanted to ruin it. With slow, calculated steps, he made his way toward her. The moment he got close enough, he spoke. Looks like you finally found a way to be the center of attention on your own. The conversation around Isabella stopped. Her back straightened slightly and she turned, her deep brown eyes meeting his in a way that sent something sharp through his chest. She wasn't surprised to see him. She was expecting him. What are you doing here, Ethan? He smirked, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. Supporting a good cause. What else? Her gaze didn't waver, and for the first time in a long time he felt something shift between them. This wasn't the same woman he had walked away from. She wasn't intimidated by him anymore, and for some reason, that made him want her even more. You don't belong here, Ethan. The words were quiet, but they weren't a plea, they were a warning, and he loved it. I belong anywhere I choose to be, Isabella. You should know that by now. Her lips pressed together briefly before she turned, back toward her group, dismissing him as if he were insignificant. A slow smirk tugged at his lips. She could pretend all she wanted, but he saw it, the way her fingers twitched slightly against the glass in her hand, the way her breathing had shifted the second she turned and found him there. She still felt him, still reacted to him, and that was all the invitation he needed. He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough so only she could hear. Tell me, Isabella, do you really not feel anything? Her breath hitched, just for a fraction of a second. But that was all it took. His smirk deepened. This wasn't over, not even close. The dinner was flawless. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, soft conversations and polite laughter filling the air. Isabella sat at the main table, keeping her posture composed, refusing to acknowledge the weight of Ethan's presence beside her. She could feel him. Even without looking, she knew exactly where he was, knew how his body radiated heat, knew the scent of his cologne. Rich, smoky, unmistakably him. And she hated that she noticed. The conversation at the table continued. Guests, toasting and exchanging pleasantries, but Isabella was hyper-aware of one thing. Ethan Lancaster. He was too close, not touching her, not yet, but close enough that his presence pressed against her like a force she couldn't ignore. You've done impressive work, Miss Carter. One of the guests complimented her with a polite smile. She nodded gracefully. I believe we have a responsibility to use our resources for meaningful change. Admirable. Ethan's deep voice cut in. Her fingers stiffened slightly around her wine glass. His tone was smooth, controlled, but provocative. She took a slow breath and ignored him, or at least she tried, because that was the moment it happened. The touch. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a feather-light brush of his fingers against hers as he reached for his glass. But it wasn't an accident. She knew it the moment his fingertips lingered, just for a second too long, just enough to send an electric current through her skin. Her grip on the glass tightened, a slow, deliberate game, a reminder that he still knew her body, that he still knew exactly how to unravel her. She could feel her pulse racing, but she didn't move, didn't acknowledge it, because the second she did, he would win, and she wasn't playing his game. She lifted her wine to her lips, steady, controlled. But when she glanced at him from the corner of her eye, she caught it. The smirk, just a ghost of amusement, because he knew she had felt it, that she still reacted to him, and that was dangerous. The gala was winding down, guests beginning to take their leave, laughter and quiet conversations fading into the background. But Isabella barely noticed, because she could still feel it. The touch, the ghost of Ethan's fingertips against hers, the slow, deliberate way he tested her control. And damn him, it had worked. She took a steady breath, willing herself to focus. She had won this round, had refused to react, but then she felt him behind her close, too close. His presence was like a heat at her back, and before she could turn, his voice brushed against her ear. "A word, Isabella." Her breath caught, not because of the request, but because of the way his voice dipped lower, his tone smooth, controlled, intoxicating. She should say no, should turn and walk away. Instead, she exhaled slowly. Fine. Without another word, she walked toward the terrace, away from the lingering guests, away from prying eyes, but he followed. When they stepped outside, the city stretched before them, endless lights, endless possibilities. But all she could focus on was the man standing behind her. She turned to face him, crossing her arms. "What do you want, Ethan?" He didn't answer right away. Just looked at her too deeply, too intensely, like he was trying to read her, to understand something even he didn't fully grasp. Then, finally, he spoke. "I want to know." She frowned. "Know what?" He took a step closer. "How you moved on so easily." Her pulse spiked. "You think I just forgot everything? That I snapped my fingers and stopped feeling?" His jaw tightened. "You certainly act like it." She let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "That's because I had to." His gaze flickered, and then he did it again. He closed the distance, slowly, purposefully, until his body was just inches from hers, the heat of him wrapping around her like an invisible pull. "Tell me you don't feel anything now." His voice was low, dangerous. Her lips parted slightly, her breath uneven. She could smell the faintest trace of whiskey on him, feel the warmth radiating from his skin. His hand lifted just enough to brush against her arm, the touch barely there but devastating. Her pulse roared in her ears. No, she refused. She wouldn't fall into this again. Isabella stepped back sharply, breaking the connection. Ethan's gaze darkened, his jaw flexing. "You still think you can get to me like this?" Her voice was quiet, but steady, controlled. "I don't think, Isabella." His smirk was slow, dangerous. "Certain. I know the worst part?" She wasn't sure if he was wrong, and that terrified her. The night air was crisp, but it did nothing to cool the heat pulsing through Isabella's veins. Ethan stood before her, watching, waiting. For what? For her to give in? For her to admit that despite everything he still had a hold on her? She wouldn't. She couldn't. She straightened her shoulders, forcing her pulse to steady. "Whatever game you think you're playing, Ethan, it's over." He tilted his head slightly, a hint of amusement flashing in his sharp blue eyes. "Is it?" The arrogance in his voice sent a fresh wave of irritation through her. "You think you can just walk back into my life and no." His voice was different this time, softer, more serious. She hesitated. For the first time that night, he wasn't taunting her. He was watching her, and it unsettled her more than any smirk ever could. "I didn't come here to play games, Isabella," she scoffed. "That's all you've ever done." A shadow passed over his expression. "Maybe before." Silence stretched between them. The city lights flickered in the distance, but all she could focus on was the man in front of her. Something was different. There was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before, and that's when he said it. "I sold part of my company." She froze. "What?" His jaw tightened. "I let go of 3 of my biggest assets, walked away from deals worth more than I can count." She shook her head slightly, processing. "Why?" "Because for the first time in my life I realized something." His voice dropped lower, more raw. She swallowed hard, unable to look away. "And what's that?" He took a slow, deliberate step closer. "That I built an empire on nothing." She felt her heart stutter, her breath catching in her throat. "What are you saying, Ethan?" His eyes locked onto hers. No arrogance, no games, just truth. "I'm saying that I finally understand what I lost." The words hit harder than she expected. Her walls threatened to crack, but she forced herself to stay steady. "And you think selling a few businesses changes anything?" "No, but it's a start." She didn't know what to say. For the first time since he walked back into her life, she felt off balance. Because this wasn't the Ethan Lancaster she once knew. This wasn't the man who only cared about power. This was a man who was trying. And that was more dangerous than anything else, because it meant she might actually start to believe him. The room felt smaller, or maybe it was just the weight of Ethan's words pressing down on Isabella, making it impossible to breathe. "I finally understand what I lost." She should have felt victorious. This was what she had wanted, wasn't it? For him to regret, to see what he had thrown away. But instead of satisfaction, all she felt was uncertainty. Because for the first time, Ethan Lancaster wasn't just saying words, he meant them. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he stood before her. Not as the arrogant billionaire who had once discarded her, but as a man who knew he had failed. And more than anything, that terrified her. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. "And what exactly do you expect me to do with that, Ethan?" His gaze didn't waver. "That's up to you." She let out a bitter laugh. "No, you don't get to put this on me. You don't get to walk back into my life, say you've changed, and expect me to just—" "What? Forgive you?" Ethan exhaled, running. A hand through his hair. I don't expect anything, Isabella, but I had to tell you the truth." Silence. She hated this. Hated that part of her wanted to believe him. That part of her still felt something. She turned away, staring out at the city skyline, the lights blurring as emotions swirled inside her. "I can't do this again." She heard him move, felt the warmth of him just behind her, but he didn't touch her. For once he was giving her space. "Then don't." She frowned, turning her head slightly. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. "What?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I don't want you to come back because of who we used to be, or because of the life we had." She swallowed hard. "Then why?" His gaze burned into hers, and for the first time she saw everything laid bare. "Because I love you, Isabella." The words shattered the last bit of control she had. Ethan had never said that before. Not like this, not when it actually mattered. Her heart pounded as she forced herself to look at him. Really look at him. Could she trust this? Trust him? The man in front of her was not the same man who had let her go. He had broken her once, but now he was asking her to choose. Not because he wanted to win, not because he wanted control, but because for the first time, he was ready to be the man she deserved. And as she stood there, torn between her past and the future she could have, she knew this choice, it was hers to make. The silence between them stretched, heavy with everything unsaid. Ethan had finally spoken the words she once ached to hear. "I love you." But love wasn't enough. Not anymore. Not after everything they had been through. Isabella searched his face, looking for any trace of arrogance, any sign that this was just another one of his games. But there was nothing. No smugness. No expectation. Just a man who had finally let go of his pride, a man who was willing to wait. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "I'm not coming back to the man who hurt me, Ethan." A shadow flickered in his expression, but he nodded. "I wouldn't expect you to." She took a slow breath, forcing herself to find clarity amidst the emotions swirling inside her. "I need to know that if I choose you, it's because you're truly different, because you've learned what it means to put someone else before yourself." His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something. But instead he simply nodded, because for the first time he wasn't fighting for control. He was fighting for her, and that was what made the difference. She stepped forward, closing the space between them. The air felt thick, charged with something electric. Ethan didn't move, didn't reach for her. He was letting her come to him, her fingers brushed against his, the touch feather-light but devastating. His breath hitched, his entire body going still. She tilted her head, searching his eyes. "Show me." A sharp exhale escaped him, and then his hand slid against the curve of her waist, slow and deliberate. His fingers traced the shape of her spine, his touch no longer a demand but a request, and when their lips finally met, it wasn't rushed, it wasn't desperate, it was earned. The kiss was slow, deep, a quiet surrender. A promise. The past didn't matter anymore. This wasn't about who they used to be, this was about who they had become. And this time, when Isabella stayed in Ethan's arms, it wasn't because she was lost. It was because for the first time, she had chosen to. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows, casting golden light over the quiet countryside estate. The scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the crisp breeze drifting through the open terrace doors. Isabella stood at the edge of the balcony, a soft linen robe draped around her shoulders, watching the world slowly wake up. It felt peaceful, something she hadn't experienced in years. Behind her, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps, slow, steady. A moment later, warm hands slid around her waist. Ethan. She didn't tense, didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into the embrace, allowing his warmth to sink into her skin. He pressed a slow kiss against her bare shoulder, his breath warm against her skin. "You're thinking too much." She let out a quiet laugh. "Maybe." He tightened his arms around her slightly, pulling her closer. "Regretting your decision yet?" She turned in his arms, looking up at him, her fingers tracing the sharp lines of his jaw. "No." He studied her for a long moment, like he was still trying to convince himself this was real. "Good." His lips brushed against hers, slow and unhurried, a reminder that this time there was no rush, no desperation, no fear of losing control, because what they had now was built on something solid, something real. She pulled back slightly, tilting her head. "You still think you own everything you walk into?" Ethan smirked, but this time there was no arrogance in it, just affection. Not everything. His fingers slid against hers, tangling their hands together. "Just this." She exhaled softly, squeezing his hand. "Because this wasn't about possession. This was about choice. And this time they were choosing each other for real, for good. Love isn't about control. It isn't about winning. It's about choosing, again and again, through mistakes, through growth, through redemption. Ethan and Isabella's story wasn't about perfect love. It was about transformation, about learning that love isn't possession. It's respect, commitment, and the willingness to be better. But what do you think? Would you have given Ethan a second chance? Or are some betrayals too deep to forgive? Comment below, I want to hear your thoughts. Was their love worth saving? And if you love intense, passionate love stories, don't stop here. Click on the next video and dive into another romance that will leave you breathless. Watch now before you miss out.